doing of the academic and other literature, there's been quite a lot of research, as you might imagine, around the financial impact of COVID on individuals and households, and we've been doing some of that ourselves at Bristol, but I'm drawing on quite a lot of other people's research tonight as well. And it's just really to give a bit of an overview about kind of where we were pre-pandemic and where we've come to. So just to start, you know, where were we pre-pandemic? We weren't in a great place in some respects, and in other respects we were in a great place, depending on who you are, really, and to some extent where you live in the UK. So UK households are kind of on the eve of the pandemic held more wealth than at any point in the past half century, and that had been kind of pretty stable since around the 1980s, with the exception of some of the dips around financial crisis and recessions. And so what we were seeing really was a trend of overall wealth levels growing, but at the same time a kind of growing wealth inequality between families. So the typical family in the richest 10% of households had £1.3 million more in wealth per adult than the typical family in the fifth decile of the wealth distribution. So you're basically comparing the people at the top with the people in the middle. So the people at the top had £1.3 million more in wealth than those in the middle. And that's research that the Resolution Foundation have conducted. You probably know their work, and they've produced some great stuff generally and certainly over the pandemic. So, you know, it's a picture, we're a wealthy nation, but there's lots of inequality. And part of that picture, I think, in terms of looking aside from wealth, if we look at how families were managing financially pre-pandemic, many households came in to the pandemic in a poor financial state. So actually what we see is about half of the adult population, data from 2016 tells us about half the adult population, so that's 25 million adults, were either struggling, and what that meant was they were kind of generally living on low incomes. They were probably struggling to manage to pay their kind of basic bills and cover essentials. And another group were people who were financially squeezed, and these are people who were slightly better off. They tended to be in work, but they also had quite a lot of kind of credit commitments. They might have a mortgage, they might have unsecured credit, and they had very little savings. So they were kind of both of these groups are really exposed to the sorts of financial shocks that the pandemic has brought. And in terms of the savings kind of profile, Britain, we're not generally known, or the UK is not generally known as a nation of savers, and nearly half of UK families had savings below the value of 1 month's income. So we can see there that, you know, very little financial cushion for many households in Britain. And the figure for low-income households was 65%. So 2/3 of low-income families had less than a month's income saved. So just thinking about the kind of reasons for that, you know, why has that happened? Why have we got such inequality in both living standards and wealth? And the research tells us it's a number of reasons. Modest income growth, which was practically non-existent for lower income households over the last decade. As UK participants will know, we've had significant cuts to the social security system in the name of austerity. We've got high income inequality, which I've already talked about, and a rate of relative poverty of 22% that has changed very little over the past decade, more than a decade. And the relative poverty rate is a measure of poverty, which is the number of households that are below, have income that's below 60% of the median for household income in the UK. So generally, it's a polarized picture pre-pandemic. So what happened in the pandemic? Well, actually, and this is extremely unusual for a kind of an economic downturn as such we've seen, but it speaks to the extraordinary nature of the pandemic. Total wealth in the UK has actually increased by around £890 billion. And it's about a 6% increase. And so what we've seen over the course of the pandemic is UK households, there's kind of different aspects to why we've seen this growth in wealth. UK households have built up extra savings of over £200 billion. And that's kind of quite a lot of that is kind of forced savings, because over lockdown, we couldn't spend, we couldn't, and particularly for higher income households, social activities, eating out, leisure, were all severely restricted. So there was this kind of forced saving going on because people were very limited in how they could spend their money. And so people who had money to spend were saving it. And as a result of that, kind of linked to that, people also generally on an aggregate level decreased their loan liabilities by £17.6 billion. And what we're seeing was people paying down debt, reducing their borrowing, because actually at aggregate level, their living costs are reducing. But the other thing that the research shows is that actually rising asset prices had a massive impact. And in fact, that was the biggest impact in the wealth growth, accounting for over 80% really of that growth in wealth. And I think average house prices in the UK, in our crazy housing market, in many places, the inflation, house prices have been going up by 8-9%. Certainly where I work in Bristol, that's one crazy housing market. So that's the aggregate picture. That's a good picture. There are people benefiting economically from the pandemic because they don't have to spend so much money. They might be working at home. They're paying down debt and so on. And so what we see, and their assets where they have them are going up in value. But not surprisingly, that's not an equal picture either. So the inequality we saw pre-pandemic is exacerbated in the pandemic. So while the median family in the UK has gained nearly £8,000 per adult in additional wealth, the poorest 30% of the wealth distribution have gained just £86 per adult on average. And the richest at the top have gained a little over £50,000 per adult. So what we can see there is the inequality we had before in wealth really pulling apart as a result of the pandemic and seeing greater polarization. Of course, for people who have benefited, that's really positive. But I think what we're seeing, the people who are not benefiting are also among the groups, the people making up the poorest 30% of the wealth distribution are people who've been really hard hit by the pandemic because of the jobs that they have. They're probably in insecure work, or they're in industries where they've been exposed to COVID, or they're in industries which have been shut down by COVID. So, they're people who came into the pandemic in a poor financial state and have certainly been affected by it negatively as well. And just kind of reiterating that, what we see is people on the lowest incomes reported a fall in savings, unlike the aggregate picture, and an increase in debt compared with people on higher incomes. Because if at the lower end of the income scale, what we've seen is actually costs increase for people, because people on lower incomes pay more of their income on essential things like energy, food, and so on, and those prices have been going up over the course of the pandemic. And actually, it's estimated that the poverty risk for UK workers affected by the pandemic, so these are people who've experienced an income shock, or had their income impacted in some way, is estimated to have doubled from 9% to 18%. And for people in one earner households, that's a jump from 26% to 40%, with a knock-on impact in terms of poverty risk for children. So I'm just going to finish by saying that, there's a so what question, isn't there? Why does this matter? But everybody here will be concerned about why it matters. And holding wealth is shown to confer lots of benefits, as I'm sure we can all appreciate. It includes things like access to higher investment income, good ability to smooth consumption, so you can kind of manage the ebbs and flows of your income and your expenditure over time. You can kind of use your assets and your wealth to smooth that, so that it's much more balanced. You have greater financial resilience. You can cope with shocks and things that happen, life events that have economic impacts. You have lower living costs as well if you're able to purchase your own home. But also, crucially, and we shouldn't forget this, wealth is also linked to higher levels of subjective well-being. So it's really important in terms of our overall mental health and well-being. And for those reasons, we need to think about what can be done to close that gaping wealth gap that's got even bigger as a result of the pandemic. So that's what I wanted to say this evening. I have also on the slides got the references to the things that I've been talking about if you're interested to read more about them. And I'm very happy to take any questions and enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was very interesting, a lot of information there. Thank you. I'm going to pass on. We've got questions after all the three speakers, but if you've got a burning question, keep hold of it, put it in the chat, or make sure you remember it for when we go to the question and answer session. So I'm going to go straight on to Gary Stevenson, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Gary Stevenson. Thank you very much, Sharon. I had a look through your slides beforehand, and that was really helpful for me, especially the numbers, exactly how much which group made. I thought that was crazy to see that the bottom 30% making £86 and the top 10% making, was it £50,000 per adult? It's pretty crazy. But I'm going to pick up basically on what you're getting towards at the end, what Sharon was talking about, of who cares, why does it matter? So my background basically is I was a trader during the 2008 financial crisis, and I made a lot of money by betting that because we wouldn't deal with the inequality that was lasting after that crisis, we would see a very long, protracted, weak recovery. So for me, whenever I see a crisis like the COVID crisis, I'm very interested to see what's going to happen to inequality and to work out how that's going to affect people and how that's going to affect the economy. So COVID has been a fascinating crisis from the inequality perspective. Is my sound okay, by the way, Emma? It's okay? Okay. Yeah, it's exactly as Sharon said. It's amazing. We've had a crisis, the biggest economic crisis in a long time. And it's led to a massive increase in the wealth of the majority of people in the country. Now, that in itself is very surprising. So we need to understand how that's happened. The reason that's been able to happen is largely because the government has dealt with this crisis with a huge amount of essentially monetary printing. They've pushed money into the economy that has been printed by the central bank. A huge amount of that was done, about £450 billion, which is about £10,000 per adult. So a huge amount of money was going into the economy. And when I saw that was happening, I wanted to know who the money was going to end up with. And exactly as Sharon just pointed out, we've seen that because so much money has gone in, the majority of people have seen their wealth increase. But the distribution has been extraordinarily unequal. And we've seen richer people and higher income people accumulate much more money. And in the first instance, that happened in the form of significant amounts of cash in their bank account, basically. So richer people accumulated large amounts of cash savings during the crisis. The question is, why does that matter? So if you're an ordinary person and you've made, £500 extra or £1,000 extra, why does it matter to you that the richest people in our society have made £50,000, £100,000, £200,000 extra? Why should it bother you if the rich are accumulating very large piles of cash? So I started to write about this at the beginning of the crisis. So obviously, if the rich were to just take that cash and put it under their mattresses, it wouldn't make a difference. But that's not what rich people do with their cash. Rich people, more than ordinary and poorer people, tend to use large amounts of cash to buy assets. So the first thing which we could very easily see was going to happen when we knew that the rich were going to accumulate huge amounts of cash during COVID was that there would be an enormous increase in asset prices And that's most visible to ordinary people in the forms of housing prices. So the reason that house prices have gone up is because rich people received 50, 100, 150,000 pounds of cash, basically, as a result of the coronavirus crisis. That's consequence number one. If the rich make loads of cash, house prices go up significantly. I said that would happen at the beginning of the crisis. We started to see that happen a lot. I think there's a long way to go. I think we're going to see really significant increases in house prices here. And that happens partly because rich people directly buy houses. I think a good sort of story to explain how this works and how it affects people is, so say you're an ordinary person who've accumulated 1,000, 2,000 pounds during COVID, and you're in your 40s, 50s, and your kid wants to buy a house. And there's somebody down the road who's from a very rich family. They've accumulated 150, 200,000 pounds during COVID, and their kid wants to buy a house. Well, they will probably give that cash to their kid to use as a deposit, and their kid will get the house, and your kid will not get the house. So essentially, this is probably the most primary way in which giving cash to rich people affects poor people. It means that poor people's children don't get houses. And, we can look at the statistics and see that youth home ownership rates are falling. This is what will happen if we allow the rich to accumulate huge amounts of cash. House prices will go up. The children of those rich people will get their houses, and the children of poor and ordinary people will not get their houses. That's the obvious consequence. Some other obvious consequences are big increase in stock and share prices. Rich people, of course, don't just buy houses. They also buy stocks and shares. And also increases in the price of other goods and services, because rich people will also increase their spending on other goods and services. So I suppose it's predictable in a way, but I think it's easy to explain. It's important to explain, because I think for ordinary people, it's easy to think, well, if the rich make cash, how am I affected? Well, house prices will go up and your kids won't get houses. Stock prices will go up and your kids won't be able to afford a pension. And prices in the shops will go up and your kids' lives will get worse. I mean, fundamentally, if you give cash to the rich and not to the poor, then when we all go out to buy things with that money, the rich will get more things and the poor will get fewer things. So it might seem like a free lunch to just give cash to rich people. And it's a very interesting way to deal with the crisis, the way we've dealt with this crisis, to allow the rich to accumulate huge amounts of cash rather than to tax them. It's similar to the 2008 crisis, but the real consequences will be less accessibility of housing to ordinary people. Now, what are the knock-on economic consequences of that? Well, if we make it significantly more difficult for young people from poor and ordinary backgrounds to buy housing, then that means they'll have to spend longer in rental accommodation. And when they do buy a house, if they're able to buy a house, because increasingly large numbers of them will not be able to buy houses, when they do, it will be through much larger mortgages. So this means they spend longer time renting, which is more expensive. And when they have a mortgage, it's larger, which means the mortgage is more expensive. This means ordinary young people will spend their whole lives with less money because they have to spend more on rent and more on mortgages. And that means they'll spend less, and that means the economy will be weaker, which means wages will be weaker. So it basically has a knock-on effect on the economy. It's my first basic point is to say that giving cash to the rich does not mean you're not taking spending power away from ordinary people. You are. And secondly, if you take spending power away from ordinary people and give it to richer people, well, you will get predictable consequences, which are ordinary people spend most of their money on goods and services, which drives wages and drives the economy. And rich people spend most of their money on houses and stocks and shares, which pushes asset prices up and makes it harder for ordinary people to live their lives. So I think that's basically covers everything I wanted to mention. I think that is a bit of a depressing picture. So I'll probably finish by saying, look, like I said, I worked in the 2008 crisis, and back then we did something very similar to what we've done now, which is we dealt with the crisis in a very new, novel way, where rather than making the rich pay for it, we actually allow the rich to profit massively from it. And it seems like a good idea because it seems like nobody pays, but the end result is big increase in inequality, big increase in house prices, decrease in housing affordability, and a very weak economy for a long period of time because you're sucking the spending power away from ordinary people. It looks like we're going to do the same thing again here. If that happens, it will be the sort of long economic disaster that we saw after 2008, like a never recovery, basically. But I think it also opens an opportunity for us to speak to people and say, look, this has happened before. This happened after 2008. We've already had one crisis where we didn't deal with inequality, and we know how that pans out. We know it leads to an increasing spiral of ever decreasing affordable housing and wages not rising. Do you want that again? And I think it's very important that we have that debate with people and we speak to them, because if we don't, we will see other narratives forming. Like, for example, we know recently the government needed money to pay for social care. at the end of a crisis where billionaires increased their wealth by 22%, where just the richest 3 individuals in the country increased their wealth by over £20 billion, they chose to raise national insurance, which is a tax just on workers and not on billionaires. So I think it's important to realize that if we don't explain to people, look, billionaires are making fortunes here and they can afford to pay taxes, and yet the taxes are coming on you, then, you know, we have a chancellor in this country who is a billionaire. So he will, if he can, probably not tax the billionaires and tax ordinary people instead. So I think now is a real opportunity to sort of pull the wool from people's eyes and say, look what happens if we allow the rich to profit massively from crises. It's going to affect you. Primarily, it's going to stop your kids from getting houses. And there is an alternative. You know, the wealthy, the very wealthy especially, and I'm not just talking about people who have wealth of even £1 or £2 million, but people who have 10, 100 billions of pounds. They have profited enormously off of COVID. And this is a real chance for us to deal with the problem of these very wealthy people who often pay extremely low rates of tax. And I've been supporting in the media the idea of a wealth tax to get more money off of these people, rather than just taxing, rather than things like national insurance, which tax on working people. And that's the perfect opportunity for me to pass over to Danny, because I believe he's going to talk to us more about the wealth tax.
Thank you. Just going to share my screen. Cool. Everyone see that? Nice. Yeah, thank you, Gary. Good evening, everyone. My name's Danny Mcgill. I'm Senior Research Officer with the Equality Trust. First off, I'm going to apologise for my voice. I've got a bit of a sore throat. I've been popping lockets by the handful, so we'll see what how the next 15 minutes or so turn out. So I'm here to talk to you about wealth taxes, and specifically some of the more complex decisions that come into play when we think about how wealth tax would be designed and implemented in the UK today. A lot of what I'm going to talk to you about is from the excellent work done by the Wealth Tax Commission, which is an independent group of economists, lawyers and accountants led by academics Aaron Advani and Andy Summers and the barrister Emma Chamberlain. And they basically set out the most comprehensive base of evidence we have about the deliverability and the desirability of a wealth tax in the UK today. So I highly recommend that if you do want to find out more about this and have the inclination to read 120-page documents about tax design, that you go and check them out. So very briefly, as a kind of an introduction, what is a wealth tax? As a very minimal definition, a wealth tax can be said to be a broad-based tax on the net ownership of wealth. We call it broad-based because a wealth tax does not discriminate on the type of asset that is owned in the way that, for example, an annual tax on enveloped dwellings does. We say the tax is on ownership of wealth to differentiate it from taxes on transfers of wealth, such as the Robin Hood tax, which is a tax on financial transactions, and it also differentiates it from a tax on returns on wealth. So that would be capital gains or something like that. And it's on net wealth because the tax is on people's assets minus their debts. I mean, the obvious example here would be the value of someone's home minus their mortgage. So the UK currently does not have this type of general tax on wealth, as you probably know, although we do have taxes that relate to wealth. We generally tax wealth at a far lower rate than the rest of the OECD. And it's easy to see the attractiveness of taxing wealth at a higher rate relative to income. Aggregate net wealth in the UK is around £15.1 trillion. That's about 7 times annual income. And it's been growing consistently basically since the 1980s, even focusing on UK residents who have total assets of at least £500,000. The aggregate value of their wealth is around 9.9 trillion. So the sheer scale of wealth means that taxing it, even at very modest rates, can generate large amounts of revenue. So it's fairly common nowadays for a wealth tax to be mooted as part of a response to a number of kind of distinct but related phenomena, whether that's the long-term widening of wealth inequality in the West, as highlighted by kind of Thomas Piketty, or or how to respond to the deficit in funding for public services following the COVID-19 pandemic, and is often contrasted with taxes on work. Now, in our opinion, this is good, and it demonstrates that there's a clear desire for progressive reform of the tax system, but it does tend to flatten out a number of key practical questions about wealth taxes. The most important being, what do we want them to do? The minimal definition we gave kind of allows us to differentiate a wealth tax from other forms of taxation, but beyond that, it doesn't really tell us how the tax will be designed and implemented, and therefore what the overall purpose of the tax is. Now, in their final report, the Wealth Tax Commission make what I think is an especially good point around the nature of taxation and public opinion. So on the one hand, tax design is an extremely specialised issue that requires a large degree of expert input. On the other hand, the issue of tax speaks in a very direct way to broader questions around the kind of society we want to live in, literally questions of who gets what. So it's fundamentally a democratic question. So because there's a need to draw a distinction between the kinds of tax policies that people support and the reasons why they might support these policies. That's to say that people can't be wrong about the society they want to live in. It's their democratic right to state that, but they might be mistaken about which tax policies will help to create that society. So equally, as activists for greater socioeconomic equality, we need to engage with people first and foremost at the level of values and adopt policies based on those conversations, as opposed to clinging to particular policy solutions because they're in vogue. So that brings me to the question of, what do people think about wealth taxes? Well, in general, support is very strong. According to a survey taken in July 2020, which asked a representative sample of adults to rank a number of tax increases, the most preferred option was to introduce a wealth tax starting at £1 million with no exclusion. And that's, I think 41% of people supported that. This had almost twice as much support as increasing council tax on properties over £1 million, as well as more support as increasing income tax on all earners or increasing VAT. Remarkably, this support is kind of consistent across a number of demographics, including ages and the income distribution, as well as political parties. Even among conservative voters, support for wealth taxes remain fairly high. In terms of thresholds, 36% generally voted for a £1 million threshold. 18% preferred a lower threshold of £250,000, and 31% preferred a higher threshold of £2 million. As we said, though, people's support for a wealth tax is not necessarily as important as why they want one. So the same survey asked respondents to rank reasons why they would support a wealth tax, which we see here. Encouragingly for us at the Equality Trust, the most popular arguments are often stated in terms of fairness and equality. So that's the gap between the gap between the rich and poor is too large. The rich have got richer in recent years, and better to tax wealth than income from work. That said, we should be a bit careful about this. It could also be understood as reflecting ideas about who could fairly be asked to contribute more in a context where tax rises were needed. Although you might very well say that COVID-19 is exactly that kind of situation. And I think we've kind of seen that with the reaction to the national insurance. So the survey also asked respondents to rank arguments against the wealth tax. As you can see, the two highest ranked answers reflect concerns around, on the one hand, avoidance. That's wealthy will avoid by moving or finding loopholes. And on the other hand, what economists would call efficiency. It isn't fair to tax savers. So there the concern is that a wealth tax would disincentivize saving. So from these insights into the public's motivations, the Wealth Tax Commission distilled a number of kind of key criteria that which the design of a prospective wealth tax should take into account. These were, as you can see, the tax should raise significant revenue. It should do so without creating excessive distortions to behaviour. It should be fair. It should be difficult to avoid, and it should achieve the foregoing objectives better than the alternatives. Now, these are the Wealth Tax Commission's criteria, but they aren't set in stone. They're obviously based on survey data which might be contested or understood in different ways. So from our perspective, we would add that sixth one. A wealth tax should significantly decrease overall disparities in wealth across society. So, designing a wealth tax. Probably the biggest decision when we come to actually kind of design our wealth tax is whether we want our wealth tax to be one-off or annual. But to clarify a bit here, what we're talking about is how the tax is assessed, not when it's collected. So a one-off wealth tax would be assessed at a given point in time and could be paid over a number of years, say 5 years. Whereas an annual wealth tax would be continually reassessed on a recurrent basis. That seems like a small distinction, but it's actually incredibly important when we come to kind of look at how these taxes fulfill these criteria. So one-off wealth taxes, we're probably more familiar in general with the idea of annual taxation because that's the way a lot of us pay tax. But looking back, there is a long history of one-off wealth taxation, particularly in response to large disruptive events. The most obvious examples here being the aftermath of World War I and II, where countries including France, Italy, Australia, West Germany, Japan, and Belgium all levied taxes of this kind, and they were successful. The Japanese levy of 1946 and 47, for example, raised about 10% of Japan's GDP those years, and it was basically all collected from the top 3% of Japan's wealthier citizens. And evidence suggests that a one-off tax on wealth could raise significant revenue in the UK today. So one example given by the Wealth Tax Commission is a one-off wealth tax on 5% on total wealth above £500,000 per individual, payable at 1% per year over 5 years, would raise at least £260 billion. So this estimate incorporates all relevant behavioural responses and administrative costs. And for reference, the NHS budget pre-COVID was around £114 billion per year. So it's a significant kind of wedge of cash, basically. Perhaps the greatest advantage of this approach is how it fulfills some of our criteria. Because the tax is based on an assessment that has already occurred, there's no incentive for taxpayers to change their behaviour. In other words, there's no loss from people changing their choices to reduce their tax burden. Of course, this relies on the tax being credibly one-off and the assessment of the tax being more or less simultaneous with the announcement of the policy. So, given these criteria, it would also be extremely hard to avoid the tax. Giving away assets or spending down wealth in the way that people do with, say, inheritance tax would have no benefit. The tax would also be relatively cheap in terms of administration. However, it's possibly worth noting that a one-off wealth tax may be more limited in terms of how it can address broader inequality. We might want to take this approach because the economic impact of COVID-19, as Gary highlighted, is likely to result in extreme disparities of wealth, more extreme disparities of wealth. A one-off wealth tax might offset this to some extent, but it doesn't necessarily deal with the longer run trends towards wealth inequality. Now, to do that, we might suggest an annual wealth tax. So interestingly, annual wealth taxes did in fact used to be relatively common across the OECD, but nowadays there's only 3 OECD nations that have an annual wealth tax, and that's Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. And the general trend has been in those countries towards higher thresholds and lower rates. So there's been a general decline in annual wealth taxes, both in how stringent they are and their general spread across high income countries. This decline kind of highlights a number of concerns we might have about annual wealth taxes. For one, these taxes are highly susceptible to lobbying, and most of these countries experience a narrowing of the tax base due to exemptions and reliefs lobbied for by elites. The effect of that was that the middle class and not the wealth elite often took on the bulk of the burden of the tax. which made them unpopular and often made them easier to get rid of than reform. These taxes also imply higher administrative costs, and because of that, they generally need higher thresholds of wealth to be workable. So a wealth tax starting at £500,000 per individual would include a large number of individuals for whom the administrative cost is likely to be offset, but is likely to offset the actual money you would raise from tax. And because these taxes are regular and recurrent, there's a variety of ways that individuals can respond to them to reduce their tax liability, up to and including evasion and avoidance. Although it should be noted that concerns around savings and migration effects are very possibly overstated. There's far less evidence for this idea that that if you introduce a wealth tax, suddenly everyone is all the wealth elite are just going to leave the country. There's far less evidence for that than you would kind of think from reading your tabloids or whatever. Nevertheless, Advani and Summers, they estimate that for an 1% annual wealth tax, between 7 and 17% of the original tax base would be lost to these behavioural responses. So, all that being said, the promise of annual wealth taxes is that they have far greater potential for redistribution and tackling widening wealth inequality. It's worth noting that since the decline of annual wealth taxes in the OECD, which primarily happened through the 80s and 90s, since that happened, things have changed. There have been a multitude of advances in kind of international tax transparency, and very recently a kind of global deal on corporation tax, which bodes well for this kind of thing. And there's a lot more awareness from in general around and effects of widening wealth inequality, although I think we'd all agree probably not enough awareness. So yeah, crucially, annual wealth taxes would do better at actually reducing wealth inequality. They'd be better than a one-off wealth tax, and they'd also be better than reforming the variety of other wealth taxes which we have in the UK. So yeah, so there lies an interesting question in how we can best design an annual wealth tax to minimize these behavioral responses. I'm going to stop talking now because I'm aware I've been talking for a while, but I hope this has been a kind of a useful introduction to some of the more complex debates around how we actually would implement something like this. As I said, the Wealth Tax Commission has a wealth of I didn't actually realize that was a pun when I wrote that. Has a wealth of information on these subjects, but if you want to read more, I would highly recommend them. I'm also happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. That was really interesting. I'm just putting the three speakers in a spotlight. There we go. I'm going to go to questions now. So I'm just having a look to see if people either want to hold a hand up or post some questions in the chat. Whilst people are thinking of that, there's a question I wanted to pose to Sharon first of all. I just wondered around the demographics of the people who've the lower end of the losers really in terms of COVID. Are there other demographics that you identified, or just in terms of kind of gender, race, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't necessarily. I mean, the same groups will have lost out who've been heavily impacted in terms of their income are very likely to also have been those that didn't have a huge amount of wealth to start with. So it is people who are in insecure work, for example, so on 0 hours contracts or doing agency work or platform economy work. Families with children were severely impacted, and particularly single parents, which tend to be single mothers. People from some Black and minority ethnic groups were particularly impacted, and that relates to their, the type of work that they have and the income that they can gain from that work. And there's other groups who have, as I mentioned, kind of came into the pandemic not in a great financial state, and that would be people, particularly people with disabilities, who have been really badly clobbered by the social security cuts, and non-workers who basically didn't get any additional support from the government over the course of COVID, even though their costs will have increased, for example. So I think there's pretty clear evidence that those are the particular groups that have been impacted. And I think there's more work underway to try and understand a bit more about the kind of intersectional impacts that happen, and get a better handle on the impacts on people from specific Black and minority ethnic communities.
Thank you, Sharon. That's really helpful. We've got a question from Angela Horn. Angela, do you want to say that question, or do you want me to say it on your behalf?
Oh, please say it on my behalf, thank you.
Okay, no worries. So we've got taxation is a way to deal with a symptom of wealth inequality. How can we restructure our economy to prevent the rent-seeking and income inequality in the first place? So who would like to answer that? I'll go to Gary.
Well, I think, I'm an economist, so I'm going to talk about incentives, right? You need to create an economy which doesn't incentivize the accumulation of vast amount and the hoarding of vast amounts of wealth. Like at the moment, the situation we have now, if you're a very wealthy family with an income, with a wealth of let's say 50 million pounds, you're going to generate every year from that an income of £1.5 million just for, getting out of bed. And what you're going to do, you're going to, spend £500,000 and use £1 million to accumulate more wealth, because spending £500,000 a year, you can live a fantastic life, and then you get richer and richer and richer, and then your kids will be richer than you. And not only that, but you can very easily structure your finances so that you don't pay any taxes. You can pass the wealth on without paying any significant taxes. So we've created a system where if you are a wealthy family, the obvious and easy thing for you to do is to simply accumulate more and more and more wealth. And the consequence of that is that these very wealthy families are essentially acting as a vacuum, as it were, in our society. They're spending so much money on attracting wealth to them that they end up sucking the wealth away from poor and ordinary families. And we've got nothing in the system to stop them from doing that or to disincentivize them from doing that. And they get a great life from it, and they'll be rich forever. So we need to create a system which says, okay, if you accumulate huge amounts of wealth, you have to pay something back, or because you are affecting the economy and you are affecting society. So something like a wealth tax is an obvious example. I've got an idea on my website called the wealth time limit, which means that very wealthy families can't control huge amounts of resources long after the person who made that money is dead. But you have to disincentivize it. You have to disincentivize it. At the moment, very, very wealthy people are extremely rewarded for vastly accumulating wealth. And if we don't tax them or attempt in any way to take that wealth back, they will get richer and the rest of us will get poorer. That's, it's a systemic problem.
Thanks, Gary. Does Sharon or Danny want to add to that at all?
I mean, I would say that, this is kind of only a part of a much broader response to this, but fundamentally with the issue of income inequality, what you're looking at is in the engines of what drives our economies, which is corporations, the balance between capital and workers over the past kind of 40 years or so has become radically tipped in favor of capital and wealth as opposed to income. And to be honest, the responses to that are fairly set in stone in terms of that period of is massively associated with the decline in collective bargaining and financialization of the firm. So I mean, in some sense it sounds almost like going backwards, but in some senses we know how we got here. So what you're talking about, the idea of pre-distribution and not just kind of using taxation to correct an economy which seems to, as Gary said, incentivize all the kind of wrong behaviors. Like essentially a large part of it goes back to the firm and rebalancing power within the firm, in my opinion.
Thanks, Danny. Sharon, did you want to add to that or
I don't think I've got much to add to either of those very eloquent responses. I mean, I suppose if we kind of look at it from the micro level, the impact, who are the people, as I mentioned, who are really have been badly impacted, and people who are in those new forms of employment that have kind of become much more common over the past 10 or 15 years from a very low base. So, some of that insecure work and some of those new forms of employment, I think I'm not quite, which do some people like them, have benefit from them, but generally I think they're locking people into low income, which is precarious, and things like the benefit system really is built around people having regular income that's the same every month, and actually that doesn't fit at all with the reality of many people's lives who need that support. So there's a real mismatch at the moment between the types of way that support is supposed to function and actually how people actually live their lives. So that's a kind of micro level answer to it.
Thanks, Sharon. I mean, I'll probably go to you for the next one, actually, if you don't mind. So I don't know if you are able. Some of we've got some tricky questions coming in. So the next one from Martin Wright says, how would a wealth tax maintain fairness between those who rely on direct investment for their income and those who have an annual pension? I mean, any ideas, folks? Sharon? Danny?
I was really hoping you wouldn't come to me with that question, because I actually have no idea, Martin. I'm really sorry. I think that is there is a question there, isn't there? Because I'm just thinking about pension accumulation and people who do, there are people who do rely on investment income. I really don't have an answer, so I'm going to shut up and see if I'm sure Gary and Danny can do much better.
That's fine. Good questions. It's the kind of audience we have here. That I'm glad I'm not the only one. So thank you for that question, Martin. It's food for thought for our speakers. Danny, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, it is a really good question, and I might actually have to follow up on this because it's quite a complex question. But I would say that in general with wealth taxes, there has been an impulse with wealth taxes to exclude pensions. So I think there's 7. I think there was a study of annual wealth taxes, and I think there was 7 countries that implemented them, and they'd all excluded pensions from their wealth taxes. And I think back in the 70s there was a report in the UK which considered the idea of a wealth tax, but kind of ruled out the idea of including pensions in it at all. That argument doesn't hold up as much today because pensions make up a much larger proportion of total wealth. It's about 40% of total wealth nowadays in the UK. So the thing I would say is that in terms of thresholds, investment income tends to be, pension income tends to be a higher proportion of income among the kind of moderately rich, whereas direct investment income tends to be it tends to be higher among the extremely rich, essentially. So I guess the solution to that would be some kind of work around the thresholds. As I said, I would like to kind of dig into this issue a bit more. So that Martin, I think if Emma passes on your email address, I might kind of get back to you on that. It's a really interesting question. Yeah, sorry for the slightly partial answer.
Thank you, Danny, for that. Okay, Gary, did you have anything to add to that question? It's oh, we've got.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, most proposals for a wealth tax, they suggest a threshold that is quite high. You know, sometimes it's 2 million, sometimes it's £5 million. So, you know, unless you have a very, very large pension and other wealth as well, you probably wouldn't fall into that category anyway. If you do, then, you know, it's not that difficult to value the different kinds of pensions. We have like a well built up profession, which basically does exactly that. And then we can value the different kinds of pensions to work out total amount of wealth. And then if somebody has a wealth of, you know, above 2 million, £5 million, then they will be able to pay it, you would imagine.
Thanks, Gary. So we've just got 2 minutes left. We've got quite a question that from Mark Landon, which I think could probably take an evening discussing. So I'm going to very quickly read it out and just ask for very quick answers from people, please, because we're going to go on to breakout rooms after this. So Mark, did you want to ask it yourself? I can see you there.
Sure, absolutely. No, I'm fascinated. I'm in the process of setting up a thing called the Anti-Capitalist Educators Network, and basically I'm really fascinated how our education systems kind of ignore the fact that I think that it's been very clear for probably the last 20 years anyway, that the capitalism and democracy are incompatible because of the drive of capitalism to massively increase inequalities of wealth and power. And I remember asking this question when John Maxon was doing a talk from the sort of Club of Rome, and basically, you know, he agreed. And I've asked the question a lot of times, and people say, yeah, essentially, capitalism and democracy, they don't mix. So I'm interested in this panel's view. I think the presentations have been utterly brilliant, and I really, really appreciate this event. But so frustrating that it's such a bywater of our education system that we're bringing out people who are not aware of the just systemic injustice driven through our society.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Sharon, because I know, Sharon, you have to go very soon. So if you just want to respond, and then feel free to leave us.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Martin. And I mean, I'm going to slightly focus on it from a slightly different perspective, which is we do have done work on things like financial literacy and financial capability, and certainly my impression of financial literacy in schools, it just from something I was listening to today, it is about reinforcing the status quo of what already exists, and it really is based around, you know, these notions of everybody being able to work, and work being the best way to, you know, the best way to live your life, and with not very much consideration about the variety of experiences that people have, and why they might not be able to do that. And so, sorry, again, I've come at it from a slightly micro perspective, but I think there was so little critical reflection in there, I think, about exactly the issues you're talking about. And so it's not only economic education. I think it would need to come into other areas of kind of financial education, which at the moment are lacking. But we are talking about, you know, we have financial education in primary schools and in secondary schools throughout most of the UK, and so that would seem like another missed opportunity. But I just think it's very uncritical, and it's designed to kind of pay to policymakers and governments who perhaps fund some of that education as well.
Thank you, Sharon. Danny, Gary, did you have anything to add, to say to that?
Yeah, just to say, it's an issue I'm very passionate in. The lack of good quality economics education that is available. I've got 2 economics degrees, and yeah, not worth the paper they're written on, most of them. But I've been very active in trying to produce content to educate people about economics in a way that's understandable and relevant to people's lives. I've got a lot of videos on YouTube if anyone wants to have a look or to use them to help educate. It's my channel's called Gary's Economics. I'll put a link in the chat now. So yeah, you know, I'm trying to create content to help educate people about economics. So if you like that, feel free to use it, feel free to share it, and yeah, hopefully we can help people understand things a bit better.
Thanks, Gary. Danny, did you have anything to add?
I mean, not hugely. I think Sharon and Gary have kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, our education system is part and parcel of the broader capitalist kind of milieu. So, you know, of course, it's not going to be oriented towards kind of these questions which you're asking, Mark. But I think, yeah, exactly what you're doing and what Gary's doing, setting up these kind of alternative educational routes is a brilliant first step. Yeah.
Thanks, Danny. And obviously, at the Equality Trust, we are apolitical. So,
sorry, he said the
charity. Tarek, did I see your hand up just before we go into breakout rooms, or have I missed?
Yeah, I did put my hand up. Really, I mean, this is such a difficult and complex issue, which I think the 3 speakers have explained very well. And one of the things that always kind of taxes me is whether there should be more focus on changing societal norms about what's acceptable in terms of wealth accumulation, because up to recently, at least, it's been something that's been quite celebrated. You know, that people becoming kind of self-made millionaires and being hugely successful, and we see the internet businesses that have arisen and become extremely powerful. I think there's a slight shift in that. I detect there's a slight shift in popular attitude, but just getting to the point, I understand that the system incentivizes wealth accumulation, and that's a hard thing to overcome, but it's always a choice on the part of individuals to go down that route. And there are some people who are very wealthy but tend to be more philanthropic. Now, obviously, philanthropy doesn't make up for the low levels of tax that they pay, but clearly there's something there that could possibly be worked on, which might make annual taxes in the future more viable if there's a change in the way that people, including extremely wealthy people, view their role in society and what's acceptable behavior. And that may be extremely naive and kind of unrealistic, but I just think that this idea of kind of the psychology of wealth accumulators and how you shift behavioral norms is an interesting one.
Yes, no, absolutely. Gary, I'm going to go to you for that question first.
Yeah, look, I think there's a big battle for hearts and minds out there that I'm engaged in every day, which is what can we convince people that what you need to do is to tax rich people more? And there's a variety of arguments that come back against that. And I think sort of changing where people stand on sort of what's right, what's ethical is definitely one big part of it. But, you know, I think increasingly, you know, we're not winning everyone, but I think we're winning that battle. I think most people, you know, some of the data which I think Danny shows that people are not happy with the level of inequality that we have. They don't think it's right. They don't think it's good. But I think there's also a narrative out there, which is that it's unavoidable, or that it's the price we have to pay for a strong economy. And I think it's narratives like those that prevent us from making progress. I think people have been sort of told for too long, you know, inequality is a necessary evil. But look, my career is I made, you know, millions of pounds by betting on the fact if we don't fix inequality, we won't fix the economy. So, you know, I'm a testament to the fact that inequality is destructive, not just to our social fabric. I mean, loads of work has been done by that. You know, you can read The Spirit Level, and I think people understand that. But it also damages the economy as well. It stops people from getting houses, stops people from getting good jobs. You know, the economy will not recover. So, you know, we need to tackle this from all sorts of different angles, and everybody needs to do the work that they can do. You know, in terms of shifting what's acceptable is one thing, but I think we also need to educate people about what the consequences will be for them and their kids. You know, we have a lot of people who are not rich out there opposing things like wealth taxes because they're scared it's going to hit them. And we need to explain, look, this is not about ordinary families, doctors, lawyers. This is about the super rich making our lives worse, you know. So there's all kinds of angles that we need to take on this. I think the moral angle is an important one, and loads of people are working on that. And, you know, if you have the opportunity to work on that, you should. But we also need to be able to explain to people it's not just about what's right and what's wrong. It's also about whether your kids have a house to raise their kids in, you know?
Beautifully put, Gary. Thank you. Danny, Sharon, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I'd say a couple of things to that. Just, I mean, leading on from Gary's point, that point around, you know, these aren't like the people who do object often aren't the people that, you know, who are affected by these things. I think from that survey data, because it was that I showed in my presentation, because it was a nationally representative sample, only about 5% of the people included in that survey were going to be affected by a wealth tax on assets above £500,000. But there were clearly some objections which are way above 5%. So yeah, so, and I would say as well that, you know, we, as Gary said, we need to continually make this point that, you know, this is not even about people that we might consider rich. Like we talk about GPs or people like that who are on, you know, relatively high salaries, you would say, in the hundreds of thousands. Realistically, in the UK, if you're at the 90th percentile of wealth distribution, you're still probably closer to the 50th percentile than you are to the top 1%. Really, inequality happens in that 10%. So it's really, and you know, when it really happens is that top 1%. So if you look at the way wealth is distributed, you literally do see the poorest, and then it kind of levels out, and then there's a huge rise right at the end. But yeah, Tarek, to your question about kind of, to your point about kind of changing the psychology a bit, I mean, these things do exist, like Patriotic Millionaires. I don't know if you've heard of them. They've come out really strongly in terms of a wealth tax, and arguably kind of a lot of things around kind of ESG, economic and social governance, and ideas around stakeholder capitalism and stuff like that are arguably driven, if not by kind of altruistic motives on behalf of kind of the wealthiest, they might be driven by kind of a recognition of the structural consequences of large scale inequality and what that might mean for the ultra rich as time goes on and those structural kind of tensions play out. That said, you know, can you rely on beneficial elites to kind of bring about meaningful and lasting reform? I'm not entirely sure. So I think, you know, part of the point of my presentation was that if we are to kind of have these redistributive policies, it can't just be an annual wealth tax. It has to go along with kind of wider changes to the political system. For example, I highlight the role of lobbying in deconstructing a lot of extant kind of annual wealth taxes. So, you know, that, you know, might tell you, you know, the kind of reforms you might need to the political system to actually kind of ensure that these changes aren't reliant on a kind of benevolent elite. But yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly, because we've